All right. So tell me when we're good to go here.
Says recording on my end.
Okay, good. Yeah, I've got a different screen set up now. So, okay. So, Your Eminence, how about a quick little prayer to get us started and out of the lunch break?
O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of Truth, word everywhere present and fills all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls, O good one. Amen.
Amen. Espolati despota. Okay. Well, I want to thank those of you. I mean, we can always tell when we have people that take an exercise seriously, and that's beautiful. So during the break time, I got a few suggestions here. We're not going to take the time to debate them now. I'm going to give them to you later to take a look at. Some are easier to implement than others. But these were the good suggestions that came in, while we were on the break here. And as I said, I want to stay on schedule now. So let's move on to the next thing. But I just want to let you know that there'll be a little bit of wordsmithing that we'll probably do going forward. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is actually kind of something that we would have traditionally done like yesterday's session, and that's really to start to look at the SWOT analysis piece. And this is really answering the second question of where are we now. So to refresh your memory, the why question is why do we exist? Then the second question is where are we now, right? So that's why we're kind of picking back up in relative order. And what we're really going to focus on is two things: internal to us, strengths and weaknesses, and then external to us, opportunities and threats. And it's this always happens, so that so I'm not surprised by it, but sometimes people get a little bit confused on the external stuff and they keep talking about stuff about the diocese when we're really talking about what's going on in the world around us. So on the strengths and weaknesses, we're looking at things that we actually do well if you're a parish, a diocese, whatever, right? Things that give you an advantage. And the weaknesses are things that either your parish or your diocese, in your case this is a diocese, doesn't do well, a disadvantage, things you do poorly. On the opportunities and threats, and this is the point that I wanted to stress again, you'll hear me say it like 2 or 3 times, it's really about external. We're looking outside of the diocese, outside of the faith, outside of our parishes to try and find things that are happening around us that may be opportunities for us in the future, and things that are happening around us that are threats to us in the future. And the SWOT analysis, the self-reflection of a SWOT analysis, and this is the part that is always very difficult whenever we're doing church work, because everybody always wants to focus on the positive and the good as well. We should, but we never grow by just focusing on that which we're doing well. Where we grow is when we realize the opportunities we have to do something better than what we were doing before. And this is not intended to be one of those kind of half full, half empty kind of moments. This is actually trying to take a look in a moment of self-reflection, saying, how can we get better? And the essence of this, again, is not something that was created in business school. It's actually biblical in its foundation. In 2 Corinthians 13:5, we see the exhortation to examine ourselves as to whether we are in the faith, to test ourselves. And so this is a bit of a test of ourselves. Now, to kind of bring it into a little bit more of a current understanding, and kind of to show you that this applies even in the signs of genius, Albert Einstein is once reputed to have said that you can't solve the problems with the same thinking you used when you created them. And so part of what I try to do in these exercises, and part of what makes people feel uncomfortable, is moving you into a world of change and moving you into a way of thinking about things differently than the way you've been thinking up until now. That's not to suggest that everything the way you've been thinking now is incorrect or inappropriate or inopportune. It is merely to say that the way we've been thinking and the way we've been doing brought us to where we are. By the grace of God, we are where we are. It ain't all that bad, and certainly on a global perspective, it's much better than in many places. But that doesn't mean that that's the end of our journey. And so we have to start using some creative thinking to do this. Now, one of the artifices, one of the techniques that people do in this introspection part of looking at it, and again, this is true whether you're dealing with a diocese, a parish, frankly, your own life, you can do a SWOT analysis, and I encourage people to do a SWOT analysis in their own life on a regular basis. Some people call them New Year's resolutions. I prefer something a little bit more formalistic. But so you will recall that I asked you to identify all of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that you thought were facing the diocese. I then took all of the raw data and produced it into a comprehensive document of many tens of pages. I mean, in one case, I think it was like 42 pages. And then I started heat mapping it. And it's the heat map results that I put up on the website. And again, if we were doing this live and in person, if we had 2.5 days to do this, I'd have broken you up into different groups, and one group would do strengths and the other weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and you would hash out the big heat map result and come back to with a recommendation to the group as a whole, and then the group as a whole would hash it out. So in an effort to try and move us forward, I took your data, didn't change it, took the heat map data, meaning putting it in the order of priority, the number of times certain concepts were mentioned, and then merely took that list that is on the website and just distilled it down to this. So this is just the topic headings of the heat map results, and the number of times that it is mentioned is the number that you see in front of it. So, and some of them are intentionally overlapping, right? So, for example, under the first category, some of those 23 were focusing on the great hierarchy. Some were focusing on the great leadership. And we put them together in one batch here to say, really, that's really kind of the inspirational leadership of the diocese, okay? And then on some parts, you saw that there was some value or positive views associated with fiscal solvency and the stewardship and the percentage giving approach that the diocese has moved towards. Obviously, there was a recognition of orthodoxy itself as a strength. Another thing that came out clearly in your SWOT analysis is the use of English and the less emphasis on ethnicity. And then there were those that said the diocese size and quality were a strength. Now, all the rest of them showed up on the heat mapping list. And so the exercise that we have to engage ourselves in is, where do we draw the line? It's not to suggest that these other items aren't valid in the minds of some people as being strengths of the diocese, because to be sure, you could say that. But you can't list all of these things. And the truth of the matter is, one of the tests that I would give you is about harkening back to something we talked about yesterday, and that is, how would we measure these things, right? So, when we say we're good at something, do we really have a viable measure, or is this just the way we think and we feel? When, in all honesty, when we're in church world, the reality of it is, for most of these things, it's just a good feeling. It's not necessarily something that has been empirically verified or measured. I mean, one could argue, and I'm not throwing a stone at you. I've really enjoyed my time with you, but one could argue that, well, if the leadership was as great and as strong as it was, would we be better than we are now, right? Or is there areas for improvement that reflect that maybe we're not as good and strong in that area as we possibly can? So if we were doing this in a more robust and more intense exercise, one of the things that I would be driving you towards is empirically validating these, not for the purposes of being obstreperous, but for the purpose of getting the language right. And I'll give you one little example. When we were doing the strategic plan for the Orthodox Christian Prison Ministry, again, we had a full 3-day retreat in the opening session. And when they were broadcasting their strengths, they said, we have great letters that we write to the inmates. And to which my answer was, how would I know that? What's your proof of that? And they got real defensive, right? Understandably real defensive. Well, we think they're really great letters. I said, I know you think they're great letters. I mean, you're obviously writing them. My question to you is, I'm asking you the empirical question. How would I know that? How can you prove that to me? And after the defensiveness wore off a little bit, they started to understand that they could not prove that the letters were actually effective. And when it came out in the conversation, what they said, well, how would we measure that? And we said, well, let's talk about that. And I said, well, why don't you ask the inmates whether or not the letters you're writing them are effective? And they said, well, we can't do that. Well, I'd done my research ahead of time. And in fact, I'd found a Protestant church group that is very active in prison ministry. And indeed, they did find a way to survey the inmates to determine whether or not the kind of letters they were getting were the kind of letters that were very valuable to them. So the answer to that question is often the we can't is just we haven't figured out how to yet. And so normally I'd be pushing you a lot harder on validating the proof of all of these. I'm not going to do that now, but what I'm going to just ask you right now is, I put the line at a point which is about a third of the entries. And below that, we're less than a third of the entries. And so the question to you is, can we live with this line, or is there somebody who wants to advocate strongly that something below the line go above the line? It's always good to do this right after lunch because everybody's kind of like still getting the the chemicals running in their heads.
I'd like to throw out that technology communication should be part of the two.
And why is that?
Oh, wait, these are strengths, right? Okay.
Yes, sir.
I think we're lacking that a little bit. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll hold back till that was one of my weaknesses. Okay.
All right. Yeah, we'll get there.
Part of those are, everything below the line is almost like a work in progress.
Right. And that's a great way to look at it, Your Eminence, in the sense that this is not an acknowledgement that we're bad at it. I mean, obviously, some number of people thought there were some strengths in it, but it not yet reached the level of what we would call statistical significance that a consensus agreed that there was a strength here. And indeed, what you'll see is, and we're going to go back and do this at some point, is when we start to do our goal development, which we're going to get to today, we're going to go back and compare it to some of these things. And frankly, what you're going to see, to your exact point, Your Eminence, is that some of the areas you're likely going to be investing some goal effort on is in some of those areas that are below the line, to move them above the line. All right, so let's just leave it there for now. And again, we can, as with everything, revisit this. Let's make the migration to the next one, and this one is the more difficult one. This is the more soul-bearing one, and this is the weaknesses. Okay. And again, here you'll see there is a wide range. This is the one that went on for pages and pages and pages and pages. And I encourage you to go back and look at the heat map results that are on the website, because you'll get an insight. And there's one other thing that I want to make at this point to do it. So if you all would please take this as a to-do item. We cannot do everything. We can only do the things that are going to be most impactful and most critical and that are going to make the greatest impact. However, I would say to you that the diocese as a whole and the diocese council as the leadership ought to take on some of those other items. And while they may not make the list of most important, wildly important goals of strategic impact, there are things you can work on. So I don't want anyone to come away from this exercise saying we're not going to spend any time or any effort or any energy on those items that are below that. No. There are going to be ministries that will be working on it and people and teams that will be working on it. But what we've got to focus our energy on right now are the biggest weaknesses that we see that are facing us that we can actually do something about that will be more leverageable to greater results, okay? So the moral of that story is, I would hope that at one of the upcoming diocese council meetings, on your to-do list, on your agenda, you'll take the heat map weaknesses, and not the ones that we're going to work on that are going to make the strategic plan, but the rest of them, and see if there's any low-hanging fruit of things that you can work on as ministries in the diocese to help you improve certain aspects of it, even though they didn't make the final list. Okay, so anyway, so again, what I tried to do is draw the line on anything that got, a third or more of the mentions. And that's where that line ended up. It's kind of ironic that, the lack of a strategic plan made it above the line, and we're fixing that one. So that's kind of an easy one there. But as you all looked at yourselves, what the data suggested you all were coming away with is some issues associated with the administration and the operations and the size, the stewardship, fundraising, the lack of a development officer and things of that nature. Clergy issues, to be clear, when you look at the heat map results, and I actually am going to pull this one up on the screen because I want you to see this after I go through this summary. It's not bad clergy, it's support of clergy that is needed to a much greater degree than we have right now. And I'm going to put that up on the screen so you can take a look at it. The fourth item that came up on the list, again, forgive the dogs barking in the background, the workers came to the front door, is this notion of resistance and reluctance to change. And it's interesting that this made the list, not surprising, but it's interesting because that is a confirmation of something that is generally true within the church ecosystem, and not just the Orthodox ecosystem, but it's definitely true in the Orthodox ecosystem, is that we have this notion of reluctance and resistance to change. And part of the tension you feel when you talk about that is, on the one hand, we're not talking about changes in the theology. We're not talking about changes in the sacraments. We're not talking about changes in the way we practice what we're doing. What we're talking about is on the operational side of the house. And now sometimes there's overlap and sometimes they bleed over, but that's really kind of the focal point there. And then kind of what fell below the line, but one that's on everybody's list, are communications, insufficient education, youth and emerging adult issues, operational support for some of the smaller parishes. There's some selected diocese council issues, concerns about homogeneity and mission parish issues, et cetera, which we could have combined into the small parish category and whatnot. So let me do this. Let me stop the share on this, and let me share the screen to give you an idea of what that heat map data look like in the weaknesses, so you can get a sense of it. And one of the things that's going to come out pretty quickly as soon as you look at this. All right, so now you have this is the document I was referring to. Every one of everybody's comments is listed on this document at some place, including the one-offs down at the bottom, right? And they were just merely gathered together as best as we could into groupings and categories so that you can see what we're talking about in these. So let's take a look at, as an example, the one that I kind of alluded to earlier, and I'm going to, hopefully make this a little bit bigger so that it's easier to read. When we start to look at our clergy issues, some of them are internal things that we can work on. And again, these are not in any order of priority, folks. So don't think that the first one mentioned is the most important, the most frequently mentioned. It's just as they came in, they made a list, and as they made a list, they were moved over here. So there is a need for greater camaraderie. We have to focus on our pipeline of seminarians. We acknowledge that some of our clergy still need to supplement their income because the parishes are unable to support them. In some instances, there were those that thought that there was some polarization between the clergy and the laity. There were questions regarding the overall formation of new priests coming out of the seminary, whether they received all the training that they need. We acknowledge that there was some aging clergy and some retirements, and there weren't always a viable backfill option available right now. Several comments on clergy care and compensation were addressed. The absence of sufficient support for clergy families, including those that are financially struggling, focusing on underpayment, aging, insufficient vocations. Again, you see some common themes. Every one of these represented a specific comment that was given by somebody. They weren't filtered out, but they were aggregated into form to that one issue. So that's why you'll see some of the same themes being repeated over and over and over again. And one of the themes that when you start to look at this list that becomes clear is that the financial issues and the financial pressures that are experienced by the clergy are ones that occur with a lot of regularity and a lot of frequency, in addition to other things like support and things. So this is the reason why I suggest that while we don't have the time in this program to really drill down and look at every one of these comments, I would strongly recommend, obviously, Your Eminence, for you to take some time and carefully look through all of these, and the council as a whole look through all of these, and really start to parse out whatever doesn't make the list by the end of the day, and identify if there's some low-hanging fruit of some things that y'all can work on that would make a difference in this regard. Now, one other point on this one. You'll notice that the second most commonly raised item, all right, the second most commonly commented item focused on one of the biggest weaknesses being in the area of stewardship and financial viability. And it manifested itself in a lot of different areas. There's apparently a strong call for a development officer. So as reading the SWOT analysis, I realized that obviously that was something that y'all had been talking about and somebody was going to be working on, or something of that nature. But there are also a wide variety of other elements that are addressed here. So some of them are what you would expect, you know, because this was all coming around just as COVID was starting to hit. So we saw obviously the impact of the economy back then. Some of that has been ameliorated. A lot of it has not been ameliorated. Certainly in the Rust Belt, impact has not been ameliorated. And so that's one of the difficulties of doing this at a diocese-wide level is you've got vast diversity in your geography, right? So you have some, you know, mill town cities that have been devastated and some high-tech areas that are booming and growing. So there's a little bit of it of challenge here. But there was a sense that this whole notion of finances, fundraising, the decentralization, the lack of any focused development function was something that was a recurring problem at the diocese level. And of course, it was also manifesting at the parish level. And so again, no surprise here, but the point I'm driving on this one is what is always fascinating to me is that if you look at, and I'm going to go back and switch the share now just to draw the distinction here, because this is something that also raises people's questions. So the number 2 challenge in our weaknesses had to do with financial related matters, and look at the number 2 strength was viewed as financial solvency and stewardship and giving, right? So here we have a question, here we have an issue, here we have some dialogue that needs to be had because we're juxtaposing 2 concepts that appear to be inconsistent with each other. And yet we've got to find why are they not inconsistent with each other, because both of them made number 2 on the respective lists. And so I think when you sit down and look and put them side by side, and again, if we were doing this in a 2 to 3 day retreat, we'd be able to do this. But I think when you put them side by side, you will see that there is a lot of recognition and gratitude of the level of solvency the diocese has achieved, the level of support the diocese has achieved, and things of that nature. At the same time, you'll see that there is a clear understanding that the financial pressures being experienced by our parishes, by our clergy, are also manifesting themselves in the diocese, and that's an area that would require some attention going forward. So, a lot of verbiage there just to kind of give you a lot of background about how we got to where we got to in this regard. But above the line, meaning the ones that showed with the most recurring messaging, were the areas of the overall need for additional administrative and operations support and size. And yes, I know that should be a comma, not a period. And then our whole stewardship, fundraising, development officer initiatives, the clergy support issues, and maybe that's a better phraseology that we can use there. And then our overall resistance and reluctance to change, and then the lack of plan that we're addressing by this. So when we're starting to look at the biggest challenges that we're facing, the biggest weaknesses that we're facing, this is what came out of the mix. Are there any questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions?
My comment on the fact that we were high on stewardship in one area and then it's a weakness in another, I think some of that may refer to the fact that due to the percentage giving move we've made, I think it's helped us financially in the diocese. We've gotten through this pandemic, still kind of being able, and I have to give a lot of parishes credit that they've been very good about submitting their support, and that's been very good. The area where I see the stewardship is in the cases of underfunded clergy. You know, that's where we're weak in. I mean, and the question is, you know, I mean, at what point do you tell somebody I'm not going to give you a priest? I mean, it's not this simple issue. I'm not going to give you a priest until you can come up with this. But chances are they won't be able to come up with it. So how many parishes do I close? You know, I think that's always a dilemma, and that has to do with who the bishop is, his temperament and personality. And that's a reflection upon me. I mean, I'm reluctant to do that. And, you know, we do try and support some clergy with some extra money from the diocese that are not being funded properly.
Right.
But it's like, you know, I don't know. It's, I think that's a big concern. We do have clergy that are working, you know, or their wives are working jobs. And I can think of one priest that's on Medicaid right now, you know. And one level, he prefers that, because if his salary goes up too much, then he loses it. Eventually, I'd like to move him into a better parish situation where they can give him a full salary. But I think that's where, we have some small parishes that are kind of like in decline. And at what point do you pull the plug? And I know some deans would probably like me to be tougher and kind of just, I had one priest tell me we need to unite two parishes in Ohio to come to his parish, because that's a long story, but it is a legitimate issue. I would have to say, yeah, it's a problem.
So let me give you, if I could, Your Eminence, two hard, reliable, empirical pieces of data to help support what you're talking about here. One that is supportive and one that is challenging. Okay, not challenging you, but the data challenges all of us. So here's a piece of supporting data, and I'm happy to share with you later all of the basis for this. But I think you may know that the Lilly Foundation gave an initial $1 million grant, and they've upped it to a second $1 million grant to do a clergy financial wellness initiative within the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese. And one of my dear friends, he happens to be a reproductive specialist doctor down in Mobile, is kind of running that project along with Father Kostas Itaras. And so they've been gathering enormous amounts of data and surveying and whatnot. And it is, even in a jurisdiction like the GOA, which doesn't have as much of a challenge with bivocational priests as others, what we've come to understand is the huge financial pressures and strains that are put on clergy and clergy families in their circumstances, and lack of support and planning, even down to financial planning for retirement, as well as healthcare, as you mentioned, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And it is more acute the broader we look at this. And so one of the things that we have to work on and we have to focus on is how can we do a better job of helping our clergy and helping their families. There was a staggering statistic, I forget what the exact percentages, but the order of magnitude of this is that 27% of the clergy that were surveyed, and it was a pretty extensive survey, again, in this case it was all within the GOA, but 27% of them were experiencing some of the same symptoms that are attributable to post-traumatic stress syndrome. So that kind of a pressure on your shepherd is never a good answer. So this is a recurring problem that we need to deal with, and there's no jurisdiction, there's no geography, there's no parish, there's no diocese, there's no Orthodox church where I haven't confronted the same issue to one degree or another. But let me go in the other direction. Here's where the challenge comes in. And those of you that know the main part of my stewardship calling ministry know where I'm going next. The reality of it is that our data shows that we as stewards of our churches are not supporting our churches financially to the degree to which we are capable of, to be blunt. And again, hard, reliable data, which I can fill your heads full of if you want to, that show that Orthodox Christians, not just any particular jurisdiction, but all Orthodox Christians are in the top quartile in annual income in the United States. Let me repeat that. When you look at the annual income of Orthodox Christians across all jurisdictions, we are provably, not by our opinion, Pew has validated this and the census has validated this, in the top quartile in income of all people of religious beliefs, regardless of what religious tradition you come, including, Hindus and Jews and Muslims and everything, okay? Top quartile. We have now data that shows we're in the bottom quartile in giving to our churches. So top quartile in income, bottom quartile in giving to our churches, which is just manifesting itself that we don't have an income problem. We have a prioritization problem. We don't have an expense problem. We have a prioritization problem.
It's a spiritual issue. It's a spiritual problem.
And ultimately, that's exactly it. We do not understand. So this is a great quick exercise, and Your Eminence, you took us right there. A quick exercise in root cause analysis. Why is it that we are not, and again, generally, some of you are, I'm sure, exceptions. Generally, as a group, why are we not as good of stewards? And I'm not just talking financially. I'm talking about in ministry and engagement, our time, talent, strength, the whole 9 yards. And part of it, a huge part of it, is education. We do not understand what stewardship is. We don't understand our obligations as stewards. The second part of it, in all honesty, is our churches have not done as good a job communicating and serving, right? And so this is like everything else, and I'll get to it all the way at the end. I don't want to keep pushing the answer to the big question that y'all ask of why are we suffering. But at the end of the day, if the financial operations, and I'll just give you one more data point just to make this clear, okay? So this is now the study of about 275 Orthodox parishes, all jurisdictions, but obviously weighted more towards Greek Orthodox parishes versus non-Greek Orthodox parishes, okay? Looking at 275 detailed financial statements of those parishes, what we find is using a proxy tithe analysis, because obviously we don't know what everybody's income is, so I can't tell you exactly what percentage of their income they're giving their church. But looking at a proxy tithe analysis where we base it based on census data of median income of Orthodox Christians and then the median level of giving to the parishes, what we find is that generally speaking, our churches are receiving about 0.8 of 1% of their parishioners' income in the form of contributions to the church. The range is between 0.5% to 0.8%. There are some exceptions. There are some outliers. The more I get parishes that have a higher concentration of converts, the higher the percentage goes in proxy tithe analysis. No surprise there, right? So what we're seeing is a huge order of magnitude. And part of what I do when I do a financial stewardship analysis is I actually calculate for them what their stewardship income would be if all of their parishioners just made the median income. That's the halfway point, half make more, half make less. I take the median and they all tithed. And the number is staggering. In most parishes, it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars more. Well, it's not hard to see that if they had hundreds of thousands, I just did one where it was $3.9 million more, okay? It's not hard to see that if they had that extra resources, they could afford to compensate the clergy, they could afford to hire pastoral assistants, they could afford to hire youth directors, they could solve all their technological problems. So ultimately, this symptom of a financial stewardship problem is adversely affecting so many of the other things. But there's a root cause below it. So end of homily. What other general comments or thoughts or ideas do you have from looking at this list of weaknesses?
I was wondering if, to me, evangelism, homogeneity, however you say it.
Oh, yeah, homogeneity,
Homogeneity and the youth and emerging adult ministry issues all are kind of related back to what we talked about last night in terms of people leaving the church or not being engaged. So I wonder if that is a weakness, if we, put all those together and elevated that, because I think, without addressing, engagement, then we're all of these things that are above the red line will continue to be an issue.
So that is a brilliant point. And the back to the data now, both in Orthodox ecosystem and in other church ecosystems, the single strongest predictor of any health at a parish is the level of engagement of the faithful. And the level of engagement, as was asked yesterday, is measured a variety of different ways. It, of course, includes attendance at services, of course, includes attendance and participation in the sacraments, of course, includes financial support, of course, includes engagement in ministries. The answer to the question is yes. Singularly, the big issue, the big root cause, the big challenge that we're going to face is one of engagement. And by the way, all of the data shows the same thing is true, not just in the Orthodox Church, but in Christian churches as a whole. As we have become less engaged in our churches, all of these other issues are starting to manifest themselves. We start to see, for example, lack of effort in outreach and evangelism. We start to see a distancing of our youth and emerging adults. Quite frankly, engagement is the strongest single predictor of financial stewardship contributions, right? As I say all the time in my ministry, stop asking for money, ask them to get engaged in the church. Because when you get them engaged in the church, trust me, the money comes. There's so much data out there. It's not, I mean, you can't even argue with me about this one. The data proves it conducively. So Carrie, the point you're making is a critical point. So much so that what I'm going to do is actually move the line a little bit. And I'm just going to put this here as a word. And I'm going to put it in all caps. And we're going to come back to that as we start to look at what we're going to do when we start to identify the goals. So that is a root cause issue. And His Eminence put his hand early on, actually yesterday, and somebody else commented on it too. When we look at the two root cause issues in our Orthodox churches, it is education and engagement. It's the two E's. Education and engagement. The better, the stronger, the more we do in education, and the more better, stronger we do in engagement, the more all of our other problems start to fold away.
Hey, Bill, I
Yes.
have a question. This is Simeon.
Yes.
When you're talking about engagement, that makes me wonder, and also the data that you referenced before,
Mhm.
Is engagement being measured by connections with church communities that go beyond mere attendance at church services and sacramental life? For example, in the Catholic Archdiocese of St. Paul here in Minnesota, the Archdiocese has all sorts of social welfare programs that people can get involved in and so forth. And I'm wondering, is that engagement included? Does that type of engagement get lumped in with what we're talking about? And is that type of engagement generating the money that you're talking about? Because I think we have a different, just because of our size or maybe from historical context, we have a different structure here. I mean, our parishes, at least in my understanding, are predominantly centers of worship. And then there are other places that Orthodox Christians go to fulfill those other aspects of being a Christian and ministering.
Yeah, so you asked actually two phenomenal questions. Ultimately, your hierarch will make a determination, if you will, in terms of the second part of what you're talking about to some extent. But let me push back and challenge you to think about it broader. If all church is a Sunday only experience, then I'm not sure that we've properly defined church the way our Lord and Savior defined church. Does it include that? Of course it includes that. I mean, you can't get the Eucharist anywhere else. Let's make that obvious, right? But the churches that have the greatest reach internally and externally are those that can transcend the faithful from thinking that it's a Sunday only experience to a lived 24/7 experience. And there are OCA parishes. Let's drill down into very specifics now. There are OCA parishes that I know of and that I can tell you, I'm not saying in your diocese, but I'm just saying that I know of and that I can tell you that have robust external focus on ministries and activities and things of that nature. And I will tell you that if you were to externally show up at that parish and I said, however you want to measure health, you measure health, my suspicion is you'd say, gosh, that's got to be a healthy parish, because it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. And you asked one very specific question. Let me answer that with very specific data. A church that has both an internal focus and an external focus has been proven over and over again to raise 3 to 4 times more resources, money and others, than a church that just has an internal focus. Let me say that again. A church that has both an internal focus and an external focus, meaning something outside of the 4 walls of its building and its own existing faithful, will generate 3 to 4 times greater yield in everything: finances, donations of time, talents, and treasures. So it's not an accident, I think, that Christ didn't say, go make disciples of just the people from your village. That he said, go make disciples of all nations. That he didn't just say, love and care for the people of your village. He said, care for the Samaritans, et cetera, et cetera. And the more we become internal and internally focused, the less engaged our faithful are going to be, the less our parishes are going to do, other than obviously meeting the requirements of providing services and sacraments, and the less overall we're going to be able to achieve in meeting all of the requirements that our Lord taught us. So
Yeah.
part of my challenging you is to challenge you to think about, now, if His Eminence says, no, I'm sorry, we're only going to look in focus, we're only going to look internally, okay, that's his prerogative to do, and et cetera, et cetera. But I would challenge you to think about the broader perspective. And I know of OCA parishes, and I'm sure you do too, throughout the country, that have amazing ministries, that do amazing activities, that bring amazing numbers of people closer to the Orthodox faith, that frankly are catalysts for other Orthodox parishes. I mean, there's an OCA parish here in Atlanta that runs circles around the big cathedral, which is one of my churches, so I'm picking on my own, right, in some of the work that they do, so much so that these other Orthodox churches have jumped on and joined them in their feeding ministry and things of that nature. So the size, and it's a small little parish, so size, I mean, David and Goliath taught us this, among many others. The size is not the issue, right? It's the vision. What do we see as our vision? What do we see as our calling? What do we see as our opportunity? And the bigger we look, the bigger we broaden our perspective, the more we'll be able to see. And now we'll have to manage it, so you're going to hear me push you back on the other direction. But did that make sense? Is that, you understand the answer? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, I do think that, I mean, I understand the distinction you're drawing. I'm not sure it's the distinction I'm drawing, which is that I think, and I agree to a large extent to what you're saying, in that, you know, if you get more people involved when you get more people involved. I mean, it's a bit of a tautology. But it seems to me there's the outreach to, in sort of the OCA parishes that I've been involved with and so forth, sort of primarily consists in sort of a come and worship with us and experience our life as a community of worship, not come and play basketball with us, or not come and, I don't know, do some sort of community outreach activity with us. You know, there is that, but it's not the primary thing. And
So-
it seems to me that there would require, like if I was thinking about, you know, my own parish and so forth, I think, you know, there's a recognition of the importance of doing those other things, but I think that I think we would get a little bit of a pushback and say, well, yes, but it's all sort of subject to the centrality of the sacramental life and the worship in the church. And so that's the distinction I'm trying to make. And it seems like there, you know, we've said come and see, come worship with us for a long time. This seems to point toward there needs to be, if what we want to do is be robust and successful and make lots of money and have lots of things, which I mean I think is up to, you know, the, you know, Vladika and so forth, as being, is that the metric we want? Are we successful when we do that? I don't know. But if that's what we want to do, I think we need to change a little bit about how we can consider success and what we have as our prime focus.
Right. And let me draw one more distinction just to cut the salami a little bit thinner. There is a huge difference in the two examples you used. So let's come and play basketball is not what I'm talking about. Nothing wrong with that, by the way. I mean, I coached church league basketball for 15 years because it was a great way to get kids there, et cetera, et cetera. That's fine. What I'm talking about is service. It's Luke 10:37, go and do likewise kind of work. Is it just internally focused on our own liturgical practice, or do we acknowledge an obligation to serve others in ways more than just inviting them into our own liturgical practice, right? And that is I agree with you, that is a big strategic decision that you need to make.
Bill, I think it's interconnected. We take the Eucharistic food and we're refreshed and renewed in Christ, and we go to the world and share God's love and service. So it's not one or the other, it's both and. You know, it's not a matter of just saying, well, we're just here to focus on our sacramental life. Well, no, I mean, if we say we love God, then it's going to be manifest in how we love one another. And so I think it's both and. It's not either or for me.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I think that's the right answer. But Simi, do you understand why this is the challenge that's kind of coming back to you all to start to think differently, perhaps, if, and I'm not saying it's universal, but if you had a group that said, no, it's only internal.
If you're asking me, I understand that, but that's.
And I know you get it.
That wasn't, again, the dichotomy or the distinction I was trying to tease out. I mean, I understand the point you're making and so forth. And I think it just comes down to the fact that it sounds like what this boils down to is that parishes need to have a more robust community engagement strategy. And, you know, then you have more people engaged and therefore more people are engaged. That sounds right to me to a certain extent. And so I'll just leave it at that.
I also think that this is a pastoral issue in the sense that we have to be more sensitive and recognizing, discerning about what the gifts of our people are, so that we can not only have them buy in, because when I hear Bill say we need to have them engaged, I hear engagement meaning, number one, buy-in. We believe what you're saying, as we were working on this morning. But the other thing too is to take an active ownership within the life of this community, so that they're going to own up to a little piece of that work that they could do that's their very own. Sometimes I think as clergy, we're afraid to do that because, you know, we're still, you know, subconsciously, unconsciously, you know, holding on to that micromanagement. We have to be in charge of everything. It's to be our thing. We have to keep our fingers in all of it. And so that's a challenge on our part, you know, to be able to delegate that and to make that buy-in and that ownership happen for everyone.
Yeah, there is something that I always, I think that's well said, Father Paul, and I think that's really kind of the challenge to some extent that we're going to be facing as we go through this exercise, and that's the reason why I wanted to camp on this one for as long as we've camped on it. But you know, because one of the areas that I spend time on in my Stewardship Calling ministry is the whole notion of what does Orthodox servant leadership actually look like, and what is our responsibility as leader? What are our responsibilities as leaders of the church, and what should we be doing? And so I'm going to put this up here real quickly, if you'll permit me, because I think, you know, you should always listen to your lawyers. That's my first rule, right? And I always point out that St. John Chrysostom received some training as a lawyer. As far as we know, he never practiced law, but he received some training. And I always like to point that out to prove that one of us made it, okay, to sainthood. So none of the rest of us will, but at least St. John did. But I think St. John's words here are the things to me that define it in the most perfect sense. And Father Paul, this goes directly to the challenge that you were saying, not only to the clergy, of course to the clergy, but also to the laity and the hierarchy and everybody else. When he said the most basic task of a church leader is to discern the spiritual gifts of all those under his authority and to encourage those gifts to be used to the full for the benefit of all. Now unpack that for just a second. In other words, your job as a priest, your job as a bishop, your job as a lay leader is not to do it all, not to be it all. Your job is to figure out what each individual person's, I'm going to use my phrase, not St. John's, stewardship calling is. And then here's the key part. Find a way to encourage them to use those gifts to the full for the benefit of all. And those are two very important concepts that he says all in one simple sentence, that we are called to use our gifts to the full and so that we can benefit all, not just ourselves, not just our family, not just our community. And this is one of the challenges of great leaders. And St. John Chrysostom, I think, recognizing that, followed it up with the second in your face sentence, which I actually love. And he says, only a person who can discern the gifts of others and can humbly rejoice at the flowering of those gifts is fit to lead the church. So how about that for kind of a, I mean, if I'd said that, I'd be excommunicated, but we can't excommunicate St. John Chrysostom. But all kidding aside, the point that he makes here, and the point that you all are all addressing and touching at in different ways, and whether it was the way his eminence articulated it, or Simeon articulated it, or Father Paul, you articulated it, is we have got to look at ourselves as having an obligation to build each other up to fulfill the calling which God has called us to do through our churches and through the ministries that we have available to our churches. Of course, principal among those is to share the body and blood of Christ, to share the sacraments, to bring the Eucharist alive and all that. None of that is to be denied, but it goes beyond that. And I think this is really the challenge that you all are facing. And the reason why I suggested that it takes courage for a hierarch to want to undertake a process like this, because it leads you to these kinds of conversations. It leads you to these kinds of realizations. So, all right. Unless there's any,
I'm feeling pretty overwhelmed. So
yeah, let's move on. The next two are easy, Your Eminence, and then we're going to take a break. So the next two are easy. I say easy. So now we're looking at external opportunities. Okay, these are things that are happening outside of us that actually can be opportunities for us. And here, what clearly made the top of the list, I didn't need any help drawing the red line on this one, folks. It's the seekers, the nuns and duns, the people that are out there. That's the reason why I showed you that Gallup picture of your diocese that showed how white and light it is. It is an enormous opportunity in your geography to realize that there are people out there who either were something else and proved unsatisfactory, or aren't anything, and then all of a sudden, and that is an extraordinary opportunity that exists in your diocese, and one to which I hope you will be focused and committing. And of course, obviously this happens at the parish level. And then secondly, we all look at the technology and communications as an opportunity. Now, I know everybody's all zoomed out, and so we can look at it both as a weakness too. But the reality of it is, if you look at the reach that the Orthodox Church has been able to achieve in the COVID period, you would be astounded. Now, I haven't seen all the metrics on this, but the metrics that I have seen has shown a reach that is absolutely amazing. And I don't know how many of you, I mean, I know many of you, or maybe all of you, live scan your services. Some of them, and I literally spend my time going through all the different churches I can and finding every live stream service. Some have put it up on YouTube, and some have enabled the chat feature. Now, that's always a risky proposition when you do that, because you get all kinds of crazies. One of the best ones I saw was an Orthodox parish that actually had the daughter of the priest moderating the chat function. So when people got a little bit off the reservation, she got him back on board, and she edited a few down the way. But what was staggering to me is one church that I was watching, and it was a relatively small church. And all of a sudden, somebody in the YouTube chat said, "Greetings from," and they put their city, and their city was nowhere near where that parish was. Well, the other people, being distracted, started putting their greetings in. And when I started looking at the geographic reach that little bitty Orthodox church was reaching geographically, I was astounded. So I want us to continue to think about technology and communications as an opportunity. But folks, y'all don't need a whole lot of argument about this one. This one's, I think, pretty clear, unless somebody else want to offer something in this regard. We all good? Okay. So let's go to the last category of this tranche, and these are the external threats. This is what's happening around outside of us that could be a threat against us. Now, obviously, COVID was a predominant feature here. I've broadened it a little bit to other crises, right? I mean, in the day after tomorrow, I'm going to be interviewing the bishop of the Armenian church. And, they're facing their own crises that have nothing to do with COVID and things of that nature. So generally there are things outside of our control, whether it's COVID. In some cases, I mean, you guys get snowstorms and ice storms and earthquakes and things of that nature. You know, down in Florida, we got hurricanes, and so there's things that happen. But then we look at the kind of the three that I think are loosely related, although you articulate them differently. Generally, political divisiveness, the secularism and hostility to churches and Christianity generally, and then other cultural antagonisms that may be out there that aren't directly related to that. And then everything else kind of, well, true, kind of fell down low on the list. Any kind of comments or thoughts or things of that nature at this point on that? Do you have any?
No, I think those top four are good. You know,
That's pretty clear and obvious, right? Okay. So we're going to go back in time now because we're an hour ahead of schedule. So we're going to go back in time and we're going to see if we can't reach a consensus on our why statement. Okay. So there were several people that felt that the whole we thing should be all. And I think a cogent argument can be made in that regard. Is there anybody that objects to that? No? Okay, good. Let's take that one. Let's take that comment. So now there was a little bit of another linguistic exercise. All right, there's that one there. There's another linguistic exercise that changed the so that all may become one with God to just communion with God. So those words would come out, excuse me, not love, and we would just replace it with communion with God. And I think the concern, you know, so, well, I'll let you all discuss that, but.
Yeah, I think depending on how this is going to be used, if it's outside, we want to be careful that there's no misunderstanding that, you know, people who don't have all the nuances we may have goes off somewhere else with it.
Yeah, I think the concern I think that some would express here is this notion of communion, because we're a closed communion church, might connote something that's a little bit different than what was intended here in an effort to try and be more succinct. So can we live with the so that all may become one?
yeah.
Acceptable? Okay. All right. So now a little bit of a different phraseology of the same concept. And that is instead of, so instead of saying may, we've changed experience, we've to becoming one with God. And so do we want to say may become one with God or may experience becoming one with God? So one is more direct. The one you have right up here is more direct. It's actually making the affirmative statement versus just experiencing that.
Well, there is a sense that becoming one with God is a process. It's not instantaneous. So
Yes, that's true.
experience kind of implies a sense of, you know, becoming, you know, that it's a process.
So what do y'all think? Do you
All may become one with God. May so both, but I don't know.
Are
You can
we
go either
afraid
way.
of using the term? Are we afraid of using the direct term theosis? What we really mean?
Yeah, because it requires explanation.
I like what we have what we have at the top here.
So can everybody live with what we have at the top rather than experience becoming?
Well, at the top, I was thinking of perhaps something to be transformed in Christ's joy, peace, and sacrificial love, and become one with God and others. That was what I think Father Elijah had pointed, but maybe that's something altogether different than what that means right there.
Well, I think the key question we're debating right now is the experience versus becoming.
I think if you wanted to say experience, you could also say grow into oneness. Grow, so the idea is an experience where you there's a progress, there's a becoming. Grow into oneness, grow into unity with God.
I think that's captured through the may become.
Okay, well, let's put that on pause now. Let's look at, so then there was a question about changing the whole front end of this thing. And this was gendered by the notion of, because this is a diocesan why statement as opposed to just a parish why statement, do we need to add this build a solid foundation of faith-based support so that? Anybody? I mean,
Oh, that's good. I mean, that makes sense. It kind of brings the diocese into it as, the idea of equipping the saints for ministry, the foundation of faith-based work.
what do the rest of y'all think?
I think we could eliminate a solid foundation again as kind of to build a faith-based support so that we might be, but that would, again, that makes it a little bit more terse.
I think it's too wordy.
Yeah, to build faith-based support so that we might be transformed.
Well, then we have another so that, right? All may become one with God, the kind of the theosis concept. Yeah. Well, listen, can you live with the fact that a diocese that is transformational in Christ's joy, peace, and love and sacrificial love is doing its job as a diocese?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I mean, that seems to me to be logical.
Point, but there's a branch for sure.
Where?
Up on the roof.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
We got snow problems. Okay. All right. And then the last comment was replacing become one with by united with. So what do you all think about one with versus united with?
I like the original.
One with?
Yeah.
Agree.
All right. Anybody strongly disagree?
I would really say be one. You're transformed and then you will be one, not you will be transformed and then become.
Does that work for everybody?
But aren't we becoming?
Yeah, I like the original.
Yeah, that gets back to that progress issue that we were talking about earlier.
What about going this route by saying to be transformed in Christ's joy, peace, and sacrificial love so that all may become reconciled to God and others?
No.
No? All right.
I like the original.
Okay. All right. So here's the question. Whoa, we don't want to delete everything now, do we? Let's not delete everything. Can we live with this? Thumbs up if we can live with this. Let me see your thumbs or your signals and stuff like that. Everybody give me some prompt here. Give me some view here. Okay, who hasn't voted? Okay, there we go. All right. Have we got everybody there? All right. Great job, folks. Thank you so much. And again, you know, everything that we do will ultimately be a work in progress in the sense that when we put it all together, we're going to look at it and say, do we have a comprehensive whole that makes sense? Because now we're building pieces of it, and now we got to put it all together into one thematic element. Okay, so I'm a big believer that, you know, when you're ahead, the team gets to choose what happens next. Okay, so we can either choose to continue to work through when we originally were going to take a break, which was going to be at 3:30, or we can take a half an hour break now. Which would you prefer?
I don't know. What, you know?
I think we should keep going.
You feel some momentum? Okay. Anybody need to take a break right now, or can we give it another, let's see, what is it? It's 2:38 your time, so can we give it another 40 minutes or so? All right. If you need to take a break, by all means, stretch out and do it, but this was the time block that we were originally setting up to do anyway, so we're not abusing anybody quite yet. And this will allow us to get done earlier, which I know will bother a lot of you. All right, so what we're going to transition to now is a little bit of a educational segment about wigs, not the things you put on the top of your head, but wildly important goals and how they fit in the context of what we're trying to accomplish here. So we'll do the training piece, and then we're going to take a break, and then we can actually start to engage in the overall process. So what wildly important goals are, and this forms your vision. That's why you see vision in parentheses. So to stop right here, sometimes people will come up with a vision statement, and then from their vision statement, they discern all of the goals that they need to do to achieve the vision. And that's a great way to do it. I've done it a lot, and I think that works just fine. The problem with that, or the challenge with that, is you end up with a lot of items on your to-do list. And for a diocese that has limited resources and time and training and team, that sometimes can get overwhelming. So we're gonna use the 4 disciplines of execution process to give us a little more narrow focus, and then we can backfill. So what we're looking for now is answering the question number 3. Where do we want to be? And it's really kind of looking at a sense of God's calling to us at this point in time, and picking a reasonable period of time in the future as to where we want to be. So these things are biblical in their foundation. If you look at what our Lord said in the continuation of the Great Commission, he gave them some very specific instructions. He said, go baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teach them what I gave you in the playbook to do. And then to make it explicitly clear, in Acts 1:8, we're confronted with the clear instructions to be witnesses in Jerusalem and all of Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So there was some clarity of instruction. He didn't just go say, okay, you got it all, good luck, figure it out for yourselves. I mean, he gave them some clear guidance about what it meant. And there's other scriptural passage where he talks about what they're to do and when they're to go and visit and what they're supposed to take, et cetera, et cetera. So there was, even in our Lord's teaching, there was clarity of instructions that he gave his disciples. And this is what we're trying to do for ourselves. So let's start to look at, back to the 4 disciplines of execution, the first discipline. What are the wildly important goals? Okay. And I think what you find is a great expression that urgency can elevate the trivial to important. Okay. And we've all experienced this. We experience this every day of our lives. And literally, y'all don't know this, but right before we took the lunch break, I looked down because my foot under my desk here seemed like it was, in a wet puddle. And I realized that my foot was bleeding. And all of a sudden, that became the most important thing in the life. Now, at the end of the day, it's going to be fine, but urgency can sometimes create this sense of disproportionality to what is really important in that regard. So what we try to do with wildly important goals is to focus on the most important objectives that will not be achieved without special attention. Those things that, they're so big and they're so important that we're going to keep putting them lower on our to-do list and take the easier things to accomplish. Now, the model for building a good, wildly important goal, this is not the only way to do it. There's never only one way to do it. But the model that has been proven over and over again in the 4 disciplines is this model. It's a formula. You have a starting line, which is where you are now. You have a finish line where you want to be, and you have a deadline. By when will you get there? A starting line, a finish line, and a deadline. And the way the goal gets worded is to be able to create something that gives you the discipline of focus on 1 or 2 things that will make a biggest difference for everything. And the language that we use is from X to Y by when. From X to Y by when. Now, if this were a stewardship goal, this is not what it's going to be, folks, but if this is a stewardship goal, we could say from X dollars, where we are now, to Y dollars, where we want to be, and let's say in 12 months. You can replace the X with anything, the Y with anything, and the duration by anything, okay? But the idea behind a wildly important goal is there's a starting line, that's the X, a finish line, that's the Y, and the by when is the deadline by which you hope to do it. So when we start to think about Diocese overall wildly important goals, we're trying to figure out what are the 1 or 2 or 3 most critical objectives to which we've got to provide disproportionate focus and energy. Let me say this for about the 3rd time. You're going to hear me say it again. This doesn't mean you stop doing everything else. This doesn't mean that His Eminence only worries about these goals. This doesn't mean that you get the luxury as a diocese council to only work on these things. Indeed, you have to continue to work on other things. But what we know, and this comes from science, and so you see the footnote down there from an MIT neuroscientist is one of the latest pieces of research, that human beings are genetically hardwired to do a very small number of things at a time with excellence. Now, those of you who are ADHD like me are under the delusion that we can do a lot of things at the same time. The answer is we can, but the key differential here is with excellence, no. Your brain capacity has been proven not to do that. So the question we're going to constantly ask ourselves is, are these the most important things? The other achievements are secondary, less consequential. There's things we got to do. There's things we got to do. We can't not do them, but they're not the most important things that are going to make the biggest difference. So let me stop right there and say, do you understand the overall theory? And then I'm going to give you 2 applications of the theory. You with me so far on the theory? You got to do a lot of things, but we're going to pick a couple of the most important things that are going to have the greatest impact. Okay, so let me take you on a little journey. Some of you have been to the Opryland Hotel in Nashville, Tennessee. If you haven't, you ought to go. It's an experience the likes of which you've never seen before. It is the largest non-gaming hotel in the world, okay? I mean, it's got 700,000 square feet of flexible meeting space and thousands of rooms. I mean, it's one of the 30th largest hotels in the room. It is an amazing facility, okay? And the Opryland Hotel looked at the 4 disciplines of execution, and they said to themselves, okay, what is it that are our most important goals? Now, when you look at business goals, they fall generally into 1 to 3 buckets. There's either a financial goal, an operational goal, or a customer satisfaction goal. And they debated it for a long time, a lot longer than we're going to have to do it. And what they decided, their goal, their most important, singular, wildly important goal, is to move the top box score, I'll explain that in a second, from 42% to 55% at the end of the year. What's the top box score? All of you have gotten surveys at the end of any product where they say, please rate our product or service. Or they usually ask in the form of a question, you know, was our product or service excellent? And you can say 1 is strongly disagree, 2 is disagree, 3 is neutral, 4 is agree, 5 is strongly agree. Top box score is a 5. The highest rated score is a top box score, okay? So they looked at their metrics and they said, right now, we only get a 5 42% of the time. That's horrible. I mean, that's very horrible for any service organization. Well, they realized they couldn't move from 42% to 100% overnight. So they set themselves a year-long goal to move from 42% to 55% on a top box score. Are you with me so far? Okay. So then they started to look at it and they said, okay, that's our high level WIG. We know what it is. That's what we call the war. That's the war we want to be in. Now, what is the smallest number of battles that we have to win to achieve that war? And that's really what they started to focus on. What is it that will drive the behavior that we want, that top box score up to 55%, 54%? What will drive that behavior? And here's what their research showed. And they spent the time to study it. First thing, negative opinions of a hotel that are formed in the first 15 to 20 minutes are almost impossible to change. If you get a bad experience when you're checking into a hotel, it almost doesn't matter what happens next. You're going to give it a poor rating. Second thing they found, there will always be a problem with your stay or an issue that comes up or a question that arises. So what you do when that problem has arisen makes the biggest determination of how people will react to the stay at the hotel. And then in the case of Opryland, because it is so huge, what they found is the vast majority of people ate at some of the many restaurants. I don't know how many restaurants they have on site, but it's 10 or 15 restaurants on site. And so the food quality also impacted their perspective on the stay of the hotel. If they had a lousy meal, it didn't matter whether everything else with the hotel was good. They rated the hotel poorly, okay? So that's what their data showed them were the biggest three drivers in terms of getting people to think about a top box score. Well, they created a matrix that had their wildly important goal was to receive a top box guest satisfaction score from 42% to 55% in 1 year. And then they challenged each of the subgroups to create their own individual goals based on their metrics. So when you have a problem, they wanted to move from a 47% score to a 60% top box. From arrival experience, from a 50 to a 60, and from food and beverage, from a 43 to a 58. What they did that was so brilliant, and when they used the 4 disciplines of execution, is they followed the instructions of Steve Jobs. When he said, it doesn't make sense to hire smart people and then tell them what to do. We hire smart people so they can tell us what to do. Now, I want you to think about this in the context of your churches. And this applies to clergy, this applies to lay leaders, it applies to hierarchs, it applies to diocesan council. If you ask people what they want, they will tell you. If you ask people what they need, they will tell you. If you don't ask them and they don't tell you, you have no clue. And so you have no idea whether you're actually meeting their needs or their expectations. And I've proven this. I do parish retreats often, leadership retreats, and I get all the leaders there. And I also require them to have youth leaders there. And one of the questions I ask them is, about what they do with their youth ministries and their youth programs. And it always astounds me when I say, so when you surveyed your youth, what did they tell you? And they all look at me like I'm speaking a foreign language. Like, what do you mean when we surveyed our youth? Wait, you haven't asked your youth? No. You're designing a Sunday school and you have no idea whether it's meaningful or effective to them? You're designing a youth ministry and you have no idea whether it's meaningful or effective to them? What their reaction is to all of that? And I had actually done the interviews of everybody before I did this latest retreat, and including the youth leaders. And I said, would it surprise you that your youth report that their Sunday school experience is horrible, that they hate it? And by the way, one of the youth that I surveyed was actually one of the kids of the priest, which was also very interesting, but she was very honest with me. So what happens too often in church world, and it's easier to do in a hierarchical church, is we assume that the higher up we are in the organization, the more we know and the more we have to make the decision, and the less we ask questions. And what I'm asking you to do is to flip the pyramid. And what I'm asking you to do is to go out there and ask everybody, what can we do? How can we make it better? How can we improve it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you're going to get a lot of ideas that are not actionable. And you're going to get a lot of ideas that, that's interesting, but it's probably not going to make a big difference. But you're going to hear things that you have never heard before if you're trying to do it all on your own. And this gets back to St. John Chrysostom's great advice of reaching out to people and asking them to live their calling to the full. Okay, so how did the Opryland story end up? So the front desk team that was dealing with arrival experience decided that their goal was to measurably improve check-in speed. And the housekeeping team, which is the one that dealt with problem resolution, so that they were going to measurably increase room availability. And then the bell stand focused on getting their bag delivery time. Now, here's something that's staggering to you. You'd laugh at this. They found when they did their research that it typically took 106 minutes before the bags got from the front desk to your room. Now you think of it as somebody who stayed in hotels. How happy would you be if it took, that long, more than an hour and a half for your bags to get? So they said 20 minutes is the most we can do it. So those are the kind of ways that they focused on. Now, after they were diligent in implementing this in all the elements of the 4 discipline execution, we're going to do this here in a second. Here's what they found out. 9 months into a 1-year project, 9 months into a 1-year project, they had increased their top box score of stay at the hotel from 42% giving them a 5 to 61% giving them a 5. And remember, their goal was only a 55 12 months out. So in 3/4 of the time, they exceeded their goal by a material amount. And what this shows is the energy that you can devote to a few small things that will make the biggest difference in what you're trying to accomplish. And at the same time, what you're constantly fighting is what one of the other co-authors of the 4 Disciplines of Execution, Chris McChesney, talks about, is that in the moment, urgency always trumps importance. And you all know this. You all know that when you're working on something very important and the phone rings or somebody comes in your office or your kids come in or something like that, that's the moment of urgency. And the question is, can you say, no, I'm sorry, that's not going to work. I've got to stay focused on this because this is the only way it's going to happen in that regard. And so we're building a discipline that we don't normally apply. And let me show you how the order of magnitude of this can work when we start to empower our faithful within the organization and then follow their leads in this exercise. So again, I'm going to use another Apple example. So Steve Jobs, before he got sick and died, hired Tim Cook, and his sole job was to manage the Apple supply chain, how they were going to get all of the individual parts in the right place at the right time so that they can manufacture these smartphones. And what happened was that because of Tim Cook and his team's work on the most important elements, the Apple supply chain really became one of the best in the world. If you look at just-in-time delivery and their manufacturing capabilities, it's staggering what that supply chain was done, which then made it clear that as Steve Jobs became ill and was on his deathbed, Tim Cook was the logical choice to move from chief procurement officer to Apple's CEO, because he took one of the most complex activities of managing all the component parts, not just of iPhones, but of every product, and try to deliver it in the most effective and efficient manner. Here's what what Tim Cook said, and this is a quote. I'm going to read it to you, forgive me, but I want you to pay attention to it. "We are the most focused company that I know or have read of or have any knowledge of. We say no to good ideas every day. We say no to great ideas in order to keep the amount of things we focus on very small in number so that we can put enormous energy behind the ones we choose. It's not just saying yes to the right products, it's saying no to many products that are good ideas, but just not nearly as good as the other ones." And this, my brothers and sisters, is so hard in every aspect of your life, whether it's in your business life or in your church life, because you're going to have a parishioner come to you with a great idea of a new ministry, or your diocese with a great idea for a new ministry. I'm not telling you to say no, but what I am telling you is to not lose your focus on that which is most important, right? So how do you do both? Well, one way you do both is you say, tell you what, that sounds like a great idea. Why don't you go off and build a team and start to work on that and see how it goes, and then let's come back and let us know. Now, in the technology sector, that's known as a skunk works. That's where you send a group of people off to work on a new product idea or a new product exercise, and you help them with some resources, but you don't lose focus on what it is you're trying to accomplish and what you're trying to do here. And this is what I'm trying to get you to do, is reconcile both of these here. Yes, we need to continue to engage people in ministries and activities and services and service to others, but at the same time, we want to develops a significant focus. So again, the idea is that sometimes we have to say no to good ideas or even great ministry ideas in order to focus on a small number, and we can put enormous behind. And then here's the point. It's okay to spend 80% of your time on the whirlwind, that day-to-day stuff, your to-do list, all the things you need to do. But what I want to get you to do is to segregate 20% of your time and just focus on your wigs. And what I will tell you is if you really look at anybody who's defined by any standard as successful, what they will tell you is this is what they did. This is how they applied it. The reason why the 4 disciplines of executions work, and by the way, lest you think it's only a business exercise, they've implemented it in a church of 1 million adherents. The Watutu tribe in Africa implemented the 4 disciplines of execution, and it transformed the way that tribe serves their ministry and their other churches, right? So this is not just a business exercise. But if you look at it and we can provide disproportionate focus on the things that will make the biggest difference, we're going to achieve some amazing, amazing results. And I had a client that was a New York Times best-selling author. And I said to him, I said, I'm having trouble writing the book that I'm writing. And he said, well, what are you doing? And I told him what I was doing. He said, well, there's your problem. And I said, well, what's the secret? He said, every day from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., no matter what, I write. I don't answer a phone call. If somebody's bleeding, if the house is on fire, it doesn't matter. I'm writing. At 11 o'clock, I put my pen down. It doesn't matter if I'm in the middle of idea or not. I'm done. And then I go deal with the whirlwind around me. And he wrote New York Times bestselling book after New York Times bestselling book after New York Times bestselling book. And yes, he had good ideas, and yes, he did good research, and yet he's the guy that wrote The Millionaire Next Door, if you're familiar with that book anyway, and a series that followed to that. But it was, again, providing disproportionate energy and focus on those few things. Now, it's a little different in church world than it is in business world. In church world, the most typical categories of church wigs are educational wigs, forming some form of educational support and resources, ministry wigs, bringing some best practices to improve the effectiveness and engagement in critical ministries, or thirdly, operational wigs, finding a way to improve operational excellence or effectiveness in some aspect of your church or your ministry. So this isn't the only master list, but I'm just telling you that generally in church world, we're not worried about financial exercises so much in that regard. We're not so much worried about customer satisfaction as maybe we probably should be more of, but we tend to be more focused on educational activities, ministry activities, or operational wigs. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to present to you at a very high level what you came back with. Then I'm going to let you chew on it during the break, and then we're going to come back with and see if we can't focus on what are the most important wigs that we want to adopt in our diocese. So you'll remember that I asked you in your homework to give me what you thought were the most wildly important goals, and I only gave you a little bit of the education I just gave you about what a wildly important goal looks like. Here are the ones that you came up with, heat mapped in order of priority, okay? So most important on your list were financial goals, and they were worded differently, but they were all financial. Then there were communications goals. Then we got to outreach, evangelism, education, diocese administration, clergy recruitment, support, youth, and worship. This is what you reported when I gave you a blank sheet of paper and a limited amount of instruction, and I said, go to work and tell me what you think are the most wildly important goals, right? Then, you may remember, I gathered all of this and I put it back to you in the survey that you took. And this is the results of what came back when your surveys came back, and I only let you pick 3 of all of those that you developed. And here's what came back as the top 4 of the ones that were surveyed. Clergy recruitment and support, outreach and evangelism. By the way, 2/3 of you focused on that. Now, let's be honest. The pool was biased because there are more clergy in the pool than there are laity. Typically, when I do these kind of exercises, I have a much more diverse group. So I'm not surprised that jumped to paramount importance, but you'll see where I was surprised to begin with. Then you'll notice that number 2 on the list was outreach and evangelism, then youth, and then financial stewardship, right, was number 4. Again, that was that 1/3 marker. I kept using 1/3 as kind of the statistical significance. Now, here's where the fascination came from when I sorted your data. This is where you guys ended up in a very, very anomalous place. Here they are side by side. There's your SWOT categories from biggest to lowest. There's your survey categories. Here's the site map. Look at what happened in this regard. Remember on when we were doing your core values, the only one that jumped position was Christ-centeredness. Every one of the rest of them, you rated the same consistently when you did the survey from when you did the SWOT analysis. But on this one, there was some significant jumping around that took place, and a couple of the ones that made your SWOT list didn't even make the list on the survey list, right? So you saw that communications, education, diocese administration, and worship dropped off on the survey list, and clergy recruitment and support went from a very distant one. Frankly, if we were just doing a heat mapping on the SWOT analysis, it would not have made the final list. It would not have reached that statistical significance, or it would have been borderline. Let me put it to you that way. But it jumped to number 1. Outreach and evangelism was number 2. Youth was number 3, significantly higher than where it was related when you were just thinking about it on your own. And then what was interesting to me was when you were thinking on your own, the whole financial side was what was weighing on your mind. But when we got you focusing strategically and stuff, it kind of dropped down to 4th place on the list. So I just kind of present this to you to show you, usually there's some movement. It's not as dramatic to see the clergy, and it's not as dramatic to see 2 of them jump as quickly as they do. I can explain the first one because we have a biased sample. We have a sample that includes a disproportionately higher percentage of clergy than laity, and so naturally, you know, we would expect that to come in. I'm not sure I fully appreciate why the financial piece dropped down, but I think when you started to look at all the rest of them, you kind of looked at it and said, you know, they really are. If I can only pick 3, you know, that's not going to make the top of my list. Is the logical answer to that one. But I just think it's kind of fascinating that this is what came out. And so if we were to summarize them, and they are now in alphabetical order, not in order of importance. I want to disabuse you of this notion of order of importance. It's there if you want to look at it, but you got to figure out which one is order of importance. Won't matter because it depends on whether you're looking at the SWOT side or the survey side, because there was such massive fluctuation. So trying to prioritize them in order of importance, you'd have to say, which one am I looking at? But this is the listing of the 4 of them. And so what I want you to think about as we go into the break, right? And we're still going to go into the break early because I actually want you to I'm going to give you a little bit extra time on your break, but I actually want you to use some of your break to do some thinking. Would everybody, I'll leave this up on the screen, but would everybody please pick up a sheet of paper and a pencil or an abacus or whatever, quill pen or whatever you use to write, you know, Father Paul, if you want to put an ash out from your fireplace and write it on the wall, whatever, you know, and just write down these 4 categories: clergy, recruitment and support, financial and stewardship, outreach and evangelism, and youth. Okay. We are not stuck with these 4. When we come back after the break, we're going to debate these, and we're going to try and narrow it down and see if we can't reach to consensus on what are the fewest number of things that would change everything. If we could provide provide disproportionate energy to address the challenges in this area, which area would it be, or which areas would it be? And if there's something that you want to advocate for that didn't make this list, or put another way as was done previously, something you want to put on the list that you think is a collection of the items that are on the list, that's fine too, okay? But these are the 4 that I want you to think about. Now, our original break was scheduled to go from 3:30 to 4. It is now 3:06. So what I'm going to propose we do here is that we take this break here right now, and let's give ourselves let's see, 4:05 my time. I'm doing my time, folks, so don't panic. Can we agree? Is this too goofy for you all to come back at 3:50?
That's fine.
It's fine.
Okay. 350 DIC, 350 DIC. We're going to stop the recording now, but please don't disconnect the connection here. And